So does Asperger's actually still exist? I'm covering all of that and answering that exact question right now. Don't go anywhere. Hey guys, welcome back to the Aspie world. My name is Dan. I have autism, ADHD, OCD and dyslexia, and I make weekly videos on this type of content. So if you're new around here and you stumbled across this video, thank you so much. You'd like to learn more about that subject, remember to hit the subscribe button by clicking the notification bell down below. And if you're watching over on Facebook, be sure to give this page a like and a follow to see more videos just like this one. Woo! Okay guys, welcome back. What's going on? It's been, I think it's, do you know, I make so many videos, I just feel like it's been forever. So this video is all about Asperger's syndrome because one of the things I get asked a lot about is, you know, does Asperger's syndrome actually exist? Because that's what I use to describe my condition sometimes. So if you haven't already, make sure to go hit me up on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook because I make content on all those platforms, and if you haven't already, go and do that right now. Okay, so this video came about, you know, it's one of those questions that I get asked a lot about. A lot of people say to me, Dan, you know, does Asperger's syndrome actually exist? And you get comments when I make videos about Asperger's syndrome where people are just like, hey, Asperger's isn't even a thing anymore. What are you talking about? So I wanted to do a video explaining and talking about all of those things. So let's start right back at the beginning, right? Okay, so the term Asperger's syndrome refers to a set of behavioral conditions that was actually characterized by a guy called Hans Asperger back in the 1940s. Now, Hans Asperger was a German physician slash psychologist. He was working on a set of behavioral issues that he documented in young boys at the time. Then basically they had this, I don't know, this document produced, and he kind of like had this condition like labeled out. Now, during the same time over in America, a guy called Leo Kanner was doing the exact same research, the exact same kind of study groups on the same type of people. It then later became known as Kanner syndrome or early infantile autism, right? And that was what the kind of conditions were labeled. Now, the interesting thing about Hans Asperger's work was that Asperger just characterized people who had lower support needs but still had autism characteristics, whereas the Leo Kanner syndrome or the early infantile autism actually documented a bunch of different kind of levels of it, which is kind of like the autism spectrum as what we know it as now, which you have high and low support needs. So if we fast forward to the 1980s when Hans Asperger actually died, they then started using the terminology Asperger's syndrome to refer to the types of people who had lower support needs on the autism spectrum, which were documented in Hans' original papers. Now, the problem with Hans' original papers is that they were a bit rubbish because they were only saying that males could actually have autism. They didn't kind of study it in females because it was completely out of their realm of understanding, because you got to think, you know, the study was from like 1947 or something. So that is one of the big issues. The second issue is that Hans Asperger was quite involved with the Nazis, and it is something to do with that effect in Germany at the time. So this caused a whole kind of ruckus later on, which we'll get to in a moment. So people were diagnosed from the late 80s to the mid 90s. People started getting diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and then it was still kind of an autism spectrum disorder because people were still like, well, no, it's autism, it's just Asperger's syndrome, which is the type, they were calling it a type of autism, right? But then it became really, really confusing because, you know, people say, well, is Asperger's autism? Is it autism or is it Asperger's? You know, what's the difference? And you'd have to kind of write stuff like autism and Asperger's support group, etc., etc. Now you can see why that type of labeling and nomenclature can actually become quite stressful and confusing for people on the spectrum. Now, this was put into a classificational document called the DSM, which is a United States psychiatry, mental health disorder, all that kind of stuff, neurological kind of developmental disorder diagnostic criteria called the DSM. And so the Asperger's syndrome was put into the DSM in one of the editions, and it was used primarily to diagnose people who had lower support needs on the autism spectrum, so they'd be using the term Asperger's syndrome, right? And for anybody else like but lower than that, they'd use classic autism, which is another unusual term because you kind of there's no distinction really between the two. It's quite fluid, but they've given these labels that separate them out. So Asperger's syndrome was used, and people had the term Asperger's syndrome on the diagnostic criteria. And fun fact, actually my diagnosis was Asperger's syndrome. So that was what I was originally diagnosed with when I had my diagnostic papers. Now, if you fast forward to 2013, or the end of 2013, the DSM-5 edition came out, the revamped edition, and they had removed the term Asperger's syndrome from the DSM-5, and then they actually put it into something called the Autism Spectrum Disorder. Now that was a bracket, like the Autism Spectrum Disorder, which is covering a lot of people. Now why did they do this? And a very simple reason. You look at the controversy that Hans Asperger had with the Nazis, right? That was a huge thing, and I did a video all about that, and I will leave it in a link above here and in the pinned comment down below and on the end screen, so you can check out that video all about his connection with the Nazis. Now his controversy was quite interesting, and it was obviously very negative, so it negatively impacted the nomenclature of having Asperger's syndrome. The second thing was having access to support. So people who were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome tried to access autism support groups, where the autism support groups or autism support networks were like, well, you need an autism diagnosis, and Asperger's, isn't labeled autism, it's just labeled Asperger's syndrome, which caused this huge backlash of negative, uprising, because people were like trying to get access to support, but then they couldn't get access to the support they needed because it didn't have the right naming on the diagnostic paper, which was completely irrelevant because they still needed the support, right? So they decided that they would change it. And then the third thing really was the fact that it was so confusing. Is it Asperger's? Is it autism? Is it, how are they interchangeable? How does it all work? It was just a mind field of just nonsense, and it was just all over the place. And I actually remember when I first started going to an Asperger's support group, it was called it was like the Anglesey and Gwynedd Autism and Asperger's support group. It was like this huge name because they had to always put Asperger's and autism together in those things. Let's put it down to this. When you hear people say Asperger's, what they actually are saying is autism spectrum disorder and primarily low support needs. And that's pretty much how it works. Now, I never kind of shun anybody for using the term Asperger's syndrome. I use it as well because it's on my diagnostic criteria. I kind of just use it because a lot more people have heard of the term Asperger's syndrome and know a bit more about, the lower support needs side of autism than they do the kind of more severe support needs for someone on the autism spectrum. So I usually say the term Asperger's syndrome just because, I just used it for years because it was on my papers, my document, my diagnostic criteria. Now, I won't really damn anybody for using the term Asperger's syndrome. I think it's each to their own. I understand the reasons why people won't use it and don't use it as well, because that's obvious, because maybe they don't want to use those labels, and these functioning labels like high functioning, low functioning, etc., kind of can be quite a sensitive topic for some people on the autism spectrum, and you have to really respect that, because maybe they don't like using functional labels and maybe they prefer just autism spectrum disorder. And when I do anything professional, it's always autism spectrum disorder, but when I'm talking for myself, I sometimes refer to Asperger's syndrome. Or if I'm making a video because people are trying to, like this one, understand more about Asperger's syndrome and where the name came from, and etc., and does it even exist, I have to use the term Asperger's syndrome and talk about it. I think it's just fascinating. It's all part of the history of autism, and I think that we can always learn something interesting from those conversations. Now, I would like to know, do you use the term Asperger's syndrome or autism spectrum disorder? Pop it in a comment down below, because I'd love to have that conversation with you. I read and respond to every single comment. So if you are enjoying this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it on social media. Share it on Facebook and Twitter to help somebody out and understand something about Asperger's syndrome, which they probably would have never known before. Right, guys, on that note, I will see you in the next video.